Looks like we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Dive into World Building. We have a special guest today. His name is Haralambi Markov, and he is awesome, and he has a story out today. How about that for timing? At Tor.com called The Language of Knives, and we are all very excited and waving our hands in the air. Yay!
Yeah.
So, if you haven't read it already, possible spoilers, I'm thinking, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't watch the show. Anyway, because we're going to talk about world building and all kinds of cool stuff. Can I call you Harry for the hangout?
Yes.
All
Harry
right.
is fine.
Because that's my habit. I should have asked before, but anyway. So,
no, it's okay. I just like it written out fully, but in conversation, Harry is fine.
Well, so first of all, congratulations. Coolest thing ever.
It is.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm trying to think about how to dive into this. I just sort of figured, okay. I
just
read the
like
story.
the cake.
Yeah, exactly. But I didn't think the cake got sliced. So I'm going to steer where there were many other things that got sliced. I'm steering away from that. So my thought was, one of the things that I noticed about the story when I read it this morning is all of the world building is done indirectly.
Yes.
And that's something that I think is really fun, because it's the way I like to do my world building. I don't like to stop and describe like 8 million things about whatever. I like to try to kind of sneak it in. And so I really appreciated the way that you built this world simply by really tying aspects of the world into body parts.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Okay, so when I was writing the story, I was very focused on actually the relationship of the characters that they have to each other, which for me is a giant step in a new direction, because when I do secondary worlds, I focus mainly on the supernatural elements. So if I'm going to create and write within a secondary world, it usually would be front and center. But this story felt a little bit too personal, so I focused more on the relationships. And that is why, because that was the main focus and the space was very tight, the world came like in very small bits and pieces. And at the time, I actually I didn't really have a full picture of how this place looked and felt completely. But through the act of writing and creating this death ritual in great detail, I kind of like got a little bit of a sense of what these people are, and how they treat their dead, and through that how they treat life and their philosophy for it. But there is a lot to interpret as well. Like there are not all that many physical descriptions of things, and like names are kept to a minimum. Everyone is unnamed, because ultimately I wanted the story to be universal in its experience as well. And for that part, like the world had to be a little bit pushed back.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting choice, not to use names.
Yeah, well, at the same time, the story was written in a very short amount of time. This was during Clarion, and this was like, I think, the second week or the third week, the second week, and I didn't have a lot of time to finish it up. And I actually wrote most of it in one day. So I didn't have the necessary time to sit down and figure out the world as well, and I just went for the emotional connection. So it was born out of necessity mostly, but I like the effect.
Yeah, I think it's doing nice things, and if it's new for you, then that's great, because discovering something new about our writing, I think, is always very exciting.
Yes.
So, yeah. Actually, yes. It's not even that you don't use names. Now, one of the things that I've discovered. This is a story that is written in the second person.
Yes.
I.e., you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's actually a very interesting choice, and I think it works well.
There is a reason for that.
Well, sure. Tell me your reason. But I was gonna say one of the things that I have found when I have read short stories written in second person, particularly ones that I thought worked well, that the second person pronoun is generally used by authors to create a mystery about the protagonist.
Well, yeah, that was precisely the idea. The story, I'm going to spoil it for pretty much everyone who hasn't read it, but they're already here and they haven't read the story yet. The story is basically about a gay couple, but it's written in a way that omits the gender of the narrator, and the one who's actually performing the death ritual, who happens to be this world's version of Undertaker, and he is reminiscing about his life with his husband, but I felt that these sort of roles are stereotypically given to women mostly, and I wanted to challenge that by omitting the gender of the narrator, so that people would actually, start out with their gender bias, and then by one point there is this like small bit within the first, I think, scenes of the story where you kind of like get hints that this is not a woman, and then by the end it's fully understood that it's a man that we're talking about. And this was kind of like ties in with my idea that grief and experiencing loss is universal, and at the same time, shows that gay people are pretty much the same as heteronormative people, heterosexual people.
Yeah. So, yeah, I thought that worked well.
Yeah.
And and the early hints are actually ambiguous. But I think, well, no, I mean, so there's this one hint about, well, how they could never have had a child without the miraculous intervention of the gods, and that that to me seemed like a thing that could go either way, right? But then, of course, there were other mentions that were unequivocal about, like when they were young men or whatever, like that. That kind of almost slide by, but then you're like, wait, did that say? Oh yeah, it did say. Okay, all right, right? Because it just goes by in the flow, and then you're like, oh, is that what I saw back there? Yeah, it's very well done, Harry. Absolutely, I thought it was. I thought it was very well done, and I think I think that people are afraid of using second person, and a lot of people find it annoying. But I think, in fact, a lot of the problem that people have is when you're actually trying to make the you refer to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like you're breaking a wall that people don't necessarily appreciate being broken. But if you have this scenario where it's clear that the protagonist is not actually the reader,
yeah,
I think the suspension of disbelief, I think, works a little better in that case. At least in the stories that I've read, that was my subjective impression.
Well, from my experience, writing and reading second person, actually this is the first short story that I've written in second person. That was my challenge during Clarion, to write a story in second person, because I've never done it for a project. And I think that the difference, whether it works or not, is whether you're trying to use it as a gimmick, in terms of, taking the reader along and making them believe that they're there. And when that's the sole purpose of the story and the writing, it's not going to work especially well, I think, at least. While this one just was more about breaking down the boundaries, like because when you read a character, like whether it's first person or second or third person, there is some sort of like filter that the emotions don't necessarily come through. On one hand, first person can seem very melodramatic at points when you try to write such heavily emotional scenes, and it's very difficult in some cases to control, while third person can dampen the emotions too much. Whether like with you, it almost takes you in within the story, but it's clear that the reader doesn't need to identify, but there's like more of an open channel to the emotions of the protagonist. That's how I view it a little bit when I think about it, and why it's effective in this case.
Yeah.
I agree, it was very effective in this case.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenda. Glad you liked it.
I mean, I'm usually not fond of second person, but this one worked. It really worked.
Yeah, I think it can be done right, and that's exactly what we're seeing here, is that it was done right and it was effective, and that was why it spoke to obviously the editors at Tor.com. So yeah, all for the best. Okay, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about. So you've done a very interesting thing in this story, which is that you've, and I mentioned this earlier, you've linked aspects of the world and aspects of the character's emotions to body parts. As the protagonist and daughter go about dismembering their dead loved one. That was an interesting choice. Was that something that you did without thinking, or was it something that you did deliberately for a reason?
Well, it was deliberately for a reason, but the reason is that I've been having this idea of turning a human body into a cake for a very, very long time. It just popped in as a very undeveloped concept, and then it kind of like gotten through a few bits and pieces of scraps of writing that almost never felt like they had the right story connected to them. So it was just an interesting topic to me, because two of the things that we don't necessarily talk about enough, I think, are our bodies. Whether it's I'm talking about like the intimacy of bodies. I'm talking about sex. I'm talking about sexuality, how we remember people by their bodies, and then with death. We don't talk necessarily about death, and funerals are generally not a spoken subject in that sort of sense. So I decided to kind of like combine the two and present a new perspective where you are more physical with handling your loved one after they're dead. There's not that much of a stigma to it, like while we have that sort of stigma here. So basically it's just like exploring my experience with death, because like my uncle died last year, and my great uncle died last year around Eastern Orthodox Easter, just Easter, around Easter. And during the funeral, we had to go around. It was sort of like our ritual to touch and kiss him while he was laying in the coffin. It's an Armenian thing, so that really got me thinking about how we treat our dead, and this fear of dying and touching a dead person. Because, like, for me, I've never encountered that sort of ritual, and for me it was very unnatural to touch a dead person. And I feel that it's a very natural part of our existence, and we shouldn't be that afraid of at least facing death in that sort of situation.
That's in my family too, on the Italian side. There's a superstition about touching the dead at the wake.
It's more like a proper send-off.
Yeah.
It's a showing of respect in a sense. But these things are not talked about. Like, you don't go to a funeral and then you're explained what you're supposed to do. You're just seeing the adults do it, and you don't understand why they're doing it. But obviously, it's something that's being done, and no one discusses it. You just kind of like parrot their behavior and just do it out of respect without really knowing why. And that sort of like closing off communication is, I think, in a sense, problematic. And that's why I've chosen to use this world to deconstruct a lot of the things that we have, such as social rules and expectations and roles and attitudes towards others. Not so much as to critique, but more like to question and then kind of like think about it yourself a little bit. Well, at least for me.
Well, and I think you've got something very interesting going on in this story with the relationship between the protagonist and the daughter, because in a sense, well, I don't know. So, which is harder to talk about, right? The death or one's inner emotional states. And in a sense, what you've got going on in the story is that you've got these two people who find it easier to talk about death and that kind of thing. I mean, they're interacting over it. Obviously, they have to not actually talk, but they do talk a little bit at the end. It's almost like that they're using the death as a vehicle to get to emotions that seem to be more difficult for them to grapple with than the death.
Yes, in a sense, that's true. The thing with the daughter and the surviving parent is that, even families that love each other very much have complicated relationships, and those things, problems within those relationships can last for a very long time, and they can shift completely how you behave with certain people from within the family. And sort of the final funeral, and this death ritual is more like closure, in the sense of coming to terms with that it's not perfect what we have between us, but it's all we have. So we might as well get past it. It's not that much of a world-building decision, more like suffusing the story with conflict, because basically nothing much happens within the story other than people, like two people cutting up a corpse and turning it into a cake. So that sort of plot doesn't really lend itself to all that much of a conflict. So I tend to dig into the dysfunctional family narrative, or one of the main that we have, about the one parent that is the favorite, and how the other one does everything wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice. Go ahead.
I think that's a really good way to approach that subject, since, most of us, when we encounter death, it is in the family context. So it's something that the reader can really anchor themselves into to understand also, which lends itself back to your choice of using the second person really well.
Yeah. It's a universal story. That's what I wanted to make it, as much as possible, and just hit a nerve with as many possible ways as I can. So dysfunctional families, death of a loved one, regrets about certain things that we've done in life or that we haven't done in life, and reminiscing. All of these very, very human things, just to breathe life into this world and make the future make sense.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you. Well, so let me make sure that I've done this justice. You told me this morning that this was a story that meant a lot to you.
Yes.
And I think we've explored some of that, but I don't think that we've necessarily addressed it directly. So I'd like to give you a chance to tell us about why this story is important to you.
Well, why the story is important? I've been shying away from writing gay characters. I mean, one part of it is that I feared for a long time that, writing about yourself, especially when you're marginalized, won't gain me any favors. So I just chose to portray a very, very loving relationship, which is shown in flashbacks, and just focus on the positive things, because while the living parent and the daughter are not in the best of relationships, these two men had like the perfect movie relationship. And they also, which doesn't really happen all that much with gay characters, considering that we usually killed off or used as comic relief. So we're either hilarious or very, very tragic, don't get our happy ending. And then one of the characters is basically it's a sword and sorcerer story, given the background that I give. So the one that is dead is more like the gay Conan as well. So I'm taking a very masculine icon, like macho, the manliest of the manly icons, and like not taking that away from him. It's just showing him that gay people can be like that. They can kill monsters and they can go and become greatest heroes and deserve to have a magical daughter together from the gods. It's in that sense it's personal, because that's the thing. Those are things I want to see written and presented, but I don't necessarily see now. So I thought, like, well, someone should write it. May as well be me, in that sort of sense. So it's wish fulfillment for me, what I want to see more in genre.
Well, be the change you want to see in the world, I guess.
Yeah, and on a very small scale.
But I mean, I think that's important. And in a way, like, well, it plays into the whole question of representation and how people portray marginalized people. And I think it's important that we get you writing about gay people, because you have a perspective that is going to be different from everybody else's perspective.
Yeah.
In a way, by reading this story, other people can get different ideas about how to portray gay people in their own work.
Yeah, it's about widening the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense. I mean, it's a little bit tricky on one point, because there is ideally no one single right way to portray gay people, but I can be wrong for other gay people, but for me, like, that's kind of the representation that I want, and I don't want people to continuously get it wrong within their fiction, or even if they do get it right, then that the gay character doesn't play all that much of a role within the work itself, and that's mostly the reason why I wrote it, because I wanted to see myself reflected in a work where I'm, my identity is at the center of it, and get through a whole adventure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. How are we doing here? Let's see.
Well, we have half an hour.
Yeah, I was just checking in with that. All right, so I'm gonna ask a funny question, which is it's sort of a world building question and sort of not. I am not a horror person. So
yes.
I read the story and I was like, I mean, every time I read a horror story, I kind of go, but I don't. I've never really connected into the sort of. I'm not sure what it is.
It's body horror.
Well, so what I was wanting to ask you is, I know that you write a lot of things. And I think that is something of, it's a sort of a world-building thing, I think, and it's sort of
No, I didn't catch the question. You kind of like glitched on me for a little bit. What did you say?
That's okay. But so what is it about horror and maybe its viewpoint that appeals to you as a writer?
I generally don't consider myself a horror writer. That's the interesting part. Like people react to it and they label it as horror. For me, it's like this story. For me, is like fantasy. Like I don't see it as horror. I don't see it as horrifying. It's like for me to write a horror story. The way I define horror is that if I want to write a horror story, I want to make people feel frightened, or that's kind of like the thing. Whereas these types of stories, they just explore things that I don't think are explored all that often. And I mean, the treatment of the body, like these are some of the things I do, like cannibalism and mutilation after death, and just the focus on flesh with meaning to the actual story is what I'm very much interested, because like this is all we have in common, like our bodies as well as the characters in all these stories. Like that's what we all have in common, like life and death. And it's a little bit grim what I do usually, because I focus so much on the inevitable mortality and presenting it in a very polished aesthetic. At least I consider it like that. But it's more about exploration of humanity through the more unpleasant parts.
Okay, yeah, no, I don't mean to say, oh, well, obviously you're a horror writer or anything like this. But there are some, obviously, by couching it that way, I reveal that I don't know a whole lot about what horror is. So thank you for taking us in the direction that you wanted to.
Well, I think like with horror, it's more of a personal. I never actually got horror. Like when I read horror stories, I don't consider them really all that horrific. Unless they're stories with ghosts, like then I really consider them horror. But for me, kind of like the line between horror and all the other genres where they intersect kind of like blur, and I don't identify them. I use the horror vocabulary because you have like monstrous transformation, the fear, like cannibalism is a huge thing that I do also, and like being haunted by people. That's also something that I do. But ultimately, the stories that I write, I don't necessarily classify them as horror, but rather like stories that tackle, like that use these sort of devices, known for horror.
Okay.
It's weird. Like
no, it's It's cool. And this is, I mean, I wanted to hear your perspective on it because I know you have a lot of, you do not shy away from things that some people would consider uncomfortable or gross or that sort of thing, and it's obviously something that you feel is important to get in touch with those aspects that we don't often like to look at.
Yeah.
And there are really important reasons for that, and I could see that. So yeah, so that was why I wanted to ask the question, though I asked it badly, I think.
No, it's not badly. It's like I'm a little bit strange in that regard because I don't even know what I'm writing anymore. And it's very cheesy because I'm this close to saying I don't like to label my art. But it's not that I don't like to label it, it's just that for me it's very hard to do so. And the one label that comes close to helping me identify what I write is that I write weird fiction, which generally takes strangeness and moments of horror, but it's also very beautiful fiction. It's very melancholic and slow, and it's transformative fiction. And that's where I go. It's like writing quiet, emotionally laden stories with a few gruesome, elements, but generally holden to a certain aesthetic.
Okay. So, all right. Let's see. In terms of cultural influences, I'm gonna move just a little bit away from this particular story at this point. I'm thinking about the fact that you're talking to us today from Bulgaria, and I don't know that I could identify anything in particular that shows up as Bulgarian in this particular story because we're in a secondary world and all of that. But so, for example, you do have depictions of Bulgaria. It's not like you're setting out to depict Bulgaria, but so, for example, the fungi that talk softly is set in Bulgaria, and then I believe also the woman who wanted to play Miss Havisham is sort of like this futuristic, post-apocalyptic Bulgaria.
It's dystopian Bulgaria, yes, and I'm
writing. Bulgaria, there we go.
It's a financial dystopian Bulgaria that's been sold to the European Union to become a theme park, and it's called the Land of Classics. And the whole country is turned into a giant theme park, and all the cities are destroyed and built anew to resemble the great European cities from key cultural points in history, and all the Bulgarians that are born in Bulgaria are being deported so that they're turned into cyborgs that incorporate, like they're called actors, but they're basically being programmed to play certain parts. Like you'd have a production of Pride and Prejudice, and you'd have like 15 Elizabeth Bennets, and they're all kind of like, these women are altered and turned into cyborgs that really believe that they're Elizabeth Bennet, for instance. And I'm doing a follow-up on that, which is called The Infinite Proposal, and it's about Pride and Prejudice as well, and it's again a gay couple. Because that's what I want to write recently, and that's where the focus goes. But no, particularly this secondary world, I made the very, very conscious decision that I'm not going to incorporate any existing culture on this earth. So I actually don't know whether I will succeed, but in terms of world building, I'm trying very hard to create unique societies that can be my playground.
Mm-hmm.
So no Bulgaria in this in this particular world.
No, I mean, I didn't see any, and that's obviously fine, right? No issue. But I wanted to ask about it since I have seen it in some of your other work.
Yeah, it's very peculiar because at one point, like, it was told to me by Lavi Tidhar. I'm not sure whether I'm making the name justice. When I first, because I sold my first short story to him actually, and it was a very cutesy story about that was set in America actually. And when he accepted it, he said that this is really nice, but it could have been really special if you actually wrote about your own country and your own customs, and that would have made it richer in the sense that writing about casinos in Reno doesn't, because it's been seen all over the world from movies and TV shows, and that really got me thinking about writing more about Bulgaria in a sense, and some of the focus has gone there as well.
Cool. Yeah, go ahead, Reggie.
Okay. So when writing with a familiar setting, do you ever sort of struggle with finding ways to describe things that are very mundane and day-to-day in a way that will make sense to someone from another culture?
Yes. I have a lot of struggle with one particular thing that's actually not about, it's not a mundane object, but it's perhaps how you call people. Like, for instance, you would have, like, for instance, if your name is Ivan, which is Ivan, like the Bulgarian Ivan, that's how it's pronounced, Ivan. Usually when you would use it in a conversation to turn to someone and you're going to say, Ivane, pass me the salt, for instance. And that E is a Bulgarian thing. Like, we make the name sound, we make the name sound softer when we put a vowel when the name ends on a consonant. And that has been very, very difficult to convey in fiction, because if I use Ivan in the prose and then use Ivane in dialogue, people kind of like think that there are two people, or that one is called, or that the character is called Ivane, but his name is shortened to Ivan. And I have no idea how to feature that successfully in English.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I haven't had any idea how to incorporate it. I tried it for a post-apocalyptic story. No, it's actually a horror survival story. Like, that one is horror. I tried it, and the editor pointed, like, my beta readers pointed out that it's just confusing. And footnotes. Well, Shay, like, I'm not opposed to footnotes, but then the whole story has to be written in footnotes, and every time I use it, I have to use footnotes, so that might not be, like, the best of tools, but it's a good idea. I might try it.
I have a soft spot for footnotes. I really do.
Then you should read it.
I've actually been dying to write a story with footnotes, but I think that having read all the footnotes in Terry Pratchett, I think, like, I have to write a really comedic story in order to use them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think their footnotes can be used well, and I bet you would find a way. Yeah, my only thought is that whenever I'm I mean, I don't run into precisely the same problem, but when I'm working on some kind of alternate usage of a word that might be familiar to people, and I need to couch the fact that this is going to be used really differently, then I'll say things like, I'll say things like, on the first instance where I use it, I will extend the dialogue tag, or do something to kind of hang a light on it right at the beginning.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another technique that a person can use when dealing with something like that, where you're like, well,
tried, but
yeah.
it just seemed really clunky. Like, I haven't learned how to do it properly. Like, eventually I'm going to learn. I think I'm going to find a fix, but right now it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
And of course, that can be generalized to all sorts of world building, because names and how they're used in conversation and between different social statuses and classes is just a huge topic.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's going to show up in a lot of stories.
See, now I have another hangout topic idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. We have waxed quiet. Let's see, what else do I have here? Well, so another question that I have is Harry, how do you feel about, obviously you've been trying to move more into portraying gay relationships, because that's something that's very important. I'm wondering, do you also, is that part of a more general focus for you on marginalized people? Or is it, obviously it's personal to you, so that particular group would have a very important significance for you. But do you aspire to work with other kinds of marginalized groups as well?
In the future, yes. But I'm very, very cautious about it. And that sort of situation, because I need to first of all justify why I'm doing it, because one of the things that have happened in the community in the past half a year, I think, like the past 6 months, is this very intense discussion on whether people that don't belong to a certain culture should actually write in it. Like, what gives me the right to write about people of color, for instance, when I'm clearly very, very white? And, I have to have a very good reason. And although it's encouraged in the sense, the way has to be right, and with the stories that I'm telling right now, not that there hasn't been need to do this, but I just don't know how to approach it, and I think like I need the right project, and I need the time to think, do the research, and speak to people who are representatives of that group.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I personally, I have strong opinions about whether one should engage with portrayal of marginalized groups, and my view is generally yes, you absolutely should, because they're a part of your life, so why not? But at the same time, if you're going to try to portray them internally, then that's when you really have a great obligation to go through the research and make sure that you're doing things correctly and with respect and all that kind of thing.
I have to do it justice, and like before I got more involved in the SSF community, I didn't have that sort of understanding yet, that it has to be handled very gently. And now that I do, I'd rather like find a pocket of time to figure it all out before I sit to write such a project. And that at the current moment, I have a lot of stories to actually revise and work on turning the language of nice into a novel.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah.
So, so let's pursue that for a minute, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Because in a way, I typically view the world building in a short story as small glimpses through windows as you move through a house.
Yes.
Whereas in a novel, the world building, you get to go out of the house and you can actually explore these things because you have so much more room. So do you have any visions for what you might imagine exploring in a longer version of this story and a further exploration of this world?
Yes. Well, I've settled on the very, very outlandish idea to have rainbow-colored people, which explains why the man in the illustration for the story is bright red. It's his actual skin color. So the creation myth is that a very ancient being from outer space, it's a mix of science fiction and fantasy in that sense, has made of pure light and energy, has fallen on this world, and in his death he has split into the 7 visible colors of the rainbow, much like when light falls through a prism. It sort of like dies a little bit. So from those sort of like colored energies formed the first people, and they're like 7 different skin colors that are brightly colored after the rainbow spectrum. So that's basically it. Because I wanted to create a world that's very, very far removed from ours, and if I create a secondary world that's very far removed from ours, but the only similarity is that it has a lot of white people in it, that would have been like whitewashing fantasy again, and
Right.
I didn't want to make people draw comparisons from actually existing cultures based on the skin color of the people if I stuck with natural skin colors, because that would have been like immediate recollection, like what is he trying to do with all these races and colors. So I decided to opt for humanoids, but as far removed physiologically from us as possible, and like orange people sounded like fun, so.
Well, I think that those decisions that you've made make perfect sense. You know, the desire not to make everybody white, the desire not to make, not to give people associations that are pre-existing. I think that's
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely
one
great
sense,
choice.
for this type of world, I just want to play and like have fun telling the stories, while doing so in a world that kind of like reminisces our own, and that allows people to bring in their own assumptions about race and culture, and because the field has politicized a lot in recent times, and with this world I just like people to kind of like forget a little bit of that, and in different worlds that I'm doing, I'm going to be I'm going to do a lot more research to bring in existing cultures in a different way. Like for different world, I'm kind of like creating this pocket dimension where people from different regions of the world, along with parts of their city, just mysteriously pop up, and how this forced mishmash of humanity has to deal with it, and that will heavily rely on people bringing in their own cultural, their own cultural experience. So I'm engaging with that topic, but for this world, I wanted to be free to just play around with magic and creatures and sword and sorcery.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
Sure, go ahead, Raj.
Hi.
Hi.
Comment is we already have an orange person who is the Senate Majority Leader in our country. I just wanted to point that out. and the question is, why just visible colors of the rainbow?
Why just the visible colors of the rainbow? Because well,
Or I should say visible to us.
Well, yeah, it's going to be like the visible colors of the rainbows for us because it would be very, very difficult to, well, to me at least, I've been thinking about the other colors that we possibly don't see, but I can't invent it. So I just stuck with the basic 7. And
If you're working with humans, that makes sense anyway.
yeah, well, the theory behind the world is I'm creating like a multiverse, so basically one of these humanoid space beings has fallen on multiple planets, and that's why I'm going to have a lot of worlds where all the inhabitants are humanoid and look like humans because life started from one point, and it just has gone different ways. So that's my explanation for it. Just to weasel out of that. Out of that situation with having to justify just the 7 colors. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Makes sense. Any other questions from anybody? Because we're basically at the end of our time.
Yeah.
We're down to 5 minutes, and so we're just gonna take a couple questions and then see how we go. You think?
You know what? It's funny. I don't know if I have a question so much as an idea for Harry because I'm thinking about the ultraviolet spectrum that human beings can't see. And I'm like, wow, a really cool story set in that world might be the people who are ultraviolet and therefore are invisible, observing everyone else.
That's actually a good idea. I might use it. They may be like the secret. They may be like the secret people or something in that vein. It's still the world is still very much in its early stages of development, and we'll see.
Also,
where it
so
goes.
what we'll have to do is we'll have to invite you back when you have this novel out, and then you can tell us how it developed.
Okay, I don't promise a speedy delivery, but I can definitely agree to discuss.
I'm thinking positively for you, Harry. All right. Well, so we're gonna wrap this up, guys. Thank you so much for being here, Harry. Thank you so much for coming and telling us about your writing, your story. Everybody who hasn't seen it hasn't read it yet should go out and read it. Very, very fascinating story. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. I'm going to take us off the air.
Okie dokie.